Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer.
And I'm Robert Buccellato.
So, Robert, much to the shock of the citizenry of East Florida, which was comprised entirely by this point of loyalists, people who were supportive of the British cause, and East Florida had not been conquered, and in fact, the Bahamas had just been liberated by Captain Andrew Devereux and a British force launched from St. Augustine. Obviously, we talked about that conquest of the Bahamas 2 weeks ago, and one of the confusions around that conquest was when Devereux and his men, who had largely come from East Florida, arrived at New Providence. It was communicated to them that the Bahamas were going to be returned to Britain anyway in exchange for East Florida, which wasn't necessarily believed at the time, and that peace negotiations were ongoing in Paris and in Versailles. Now, of course, it would still be several more months before the peace agreement was actually reached. But the the Crown was considering, and again, at that point, the Whigs had gotten control of Parliament. This is important to the whole settlement with the Americans and with the Spanish and the French, that the Whigs had gotten control of Parliament and were looking to make sure that they could keep their Caribbean territories, that they could keep Quebec, and that they could keep Nova Scotia, and everything else was sort of on the table. Now, obviously, there were members of Parliament who owned a lot of land in Florida, as we've talked about, and there were tons of loyalists with political influence that were in Florida, and Florida had a provincial legislature, as we talked about several episodes ago. First time we had an elected legislature in the history of Florida was the East Florida Provincial Legislature, elected for the first time in 1779. So there was all this political want to keep East Florida, but it was still very tradable in order to make sure the British kept the more important possessions in the West Indies and the more important possessions in maritime Canada and Quebec. Everything else was on the table at this point. So as a result, Florida, East Florida, in the Treaty of Paris, which was signed September 1783, Treaty of Paris and Treaty of Versailles. So Treaty of Paris was with the United States. That gave the United States very generous boundaries, although the British didn't necessarily abandon all the forts in the Northwest Territory. We know that, and that was one of the causes of future conflicts between Britain and the United States. But in the Treaty of Versailles, obviously just outside of Paris, Versailles, Britain signed an agreement with France, Spain, and the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, and East Florida was ceded to Spain, much to the shock of the citizenry.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be talking in depth about the peace treaties in a moment. But as it pertains to the diplomatic corps that was deciding the peace between Britain and America, it was made up of teams of three. And on the British side, one of them had quite a lot of land and a plantation and slaves in Florida. And that was a sticking point to him, was to keep Florida. And so,
as you talked about in a previous episode, Robert, just to remind our listeners, the landowners in Florida were very politically connected in Westminster, to say the least.
So it was not. I don't think it was something. Florida was never really on the table for the Americans. I mean, Washington really wanted it, but it was not even really talked about on the American and on the British side, and it was quite a shock to the British delegates who were in charge of sort of navigating and feeling out the Americans, to realize that this whole entire other corps of negotiators with the Spanish and the French basically just sort of gave up Florida, because the Spanish were like, oh, you can't do anything with it, and we had it anyway. And the British by then were wanting to just end it as quickly as possible, and they were putting all of their eggs in the American basket because they were trying really hard to keep Canada and and make sure that France didn't get too greedy out west. So they basically just said, yeah, sure, take Florida, whatever. And so it came as a huge shock, and it was a reminder to all of these very well-heeled people that even though they had an invested interest in Florida, and as a matter of fact, they were paid handsomely to come to Florida when it was British Florida. The Crown didn't really care about them as it pertains to keeping their interests elsewhere.
Yeah, and so at this point, the Bahamas get liberated by a force coming from Florida. That may have ironically sealed the fate of East Florida as a British colony, because the British loyalists in East Florida who liberated the Bahamas felt like that was giving them kind of a buffer, and Florida very much part of the Caribbean, as you've said previously, very much connected to the Bahamas, as your family knows, right? Very well, Robert. And so that actually gave the British in their minds a safe haven. They didn't want the Bahamas back on the table. They certainly didn't want Jamaica on the table.
Jamaica,
absolutely. That was an absolute thing. And they had fought back after Yorktown to make it more difficult for the French to take Jamaica. Because the French did want Jamaica on the other Spice Islands. Don't kid yourself. That was a big goal of theirs.
And that was sort of one of the cards up the British's sleeve, was to say, well, the government, the Tory government that had given you guys all this land in Florida, they're not in power anymore anyway. But look, we have the Caribbean. You can grow sugarcane there too. We'll set you up there. Don't worry about that mosquito-ridden place with the marshes that nobody even wants to go to, that doesn't have good food, that has terrible climate conditions. Just come on over to Jamaica and the Bahamas, and that was sort of a way where, like you said, it allowed them to just sort of be able to save face with the loss of Florida, and to be able to face all of these very rich landowners who were going to be ticked off that they were, losing their estates, their livestock, their land outside of Britain.
So East Florida is surprisingly ceded to Spain in the Treaty of Versailles. Now, what became of these treaties, as Britain had hoped? Britain had done this hoping that there would be that they could keep a foot in Florida by stimulating conflict between the former allies, and it worked, because within a year of the Floridas being ceded to Spain, Spain was in a border conflict with the United States, because the British had been clever about the way they wrote the boundaries and and talked about the navigational rights on the rivers. They were the Americans were given full navigational rights on the Apalachicola River. So that I will say was not part of the issue, but it is. But then there were issues when it came to the other rivers in Florida, the Swanee, which goes into Georgia, and the Perdido River, among others. Yeah, so Robert, this was all sort of a deliberate effort by the British to create conflict, the Spanish and the Americans, and eventually what would happen, which we may cover in the future, is that this would take 10 years to resolve this border conflict between Spain and the United States. By that time, European wars had broken out again. Spain and Britain ended up being on the same side of those conflicts in the Napoleonic Wars. And lo and behold, the British, without actually having the responsibility of governing Florida, are effectively in military control of Florida. Something we talked about when we talked about Remember, we talked about the First Seminole War, Robert. We were not, even though it was Spanish Florida, we were talking about the British arming the Seminoles. We were talking about British soldiers being at Fort Gadsden on the Apalachicola River. We were talking about the British arming the Creeks in the Creek War, which Andrew Jackson fought. We were talking about the British in 1814 defending Pensacola from Andrew Jackson, even though it was a Spanish territory. And I think very important history in the part of the state you live in, Robert, the state of Muskogee, which was an Indian federation, right, led by the Seminoles, right, and the Miccosukee people, based in the town of Miccosukee, which is now in Leon County, was not only were they armed by the British, it was British sponsored. The British had sent diplomats, or had sent people like William Augustus Bowles and others from the Bahamas to teach the Seminole and Miccosukee people about governance and basically how to fight off the Americans. So and that's in 1802, right? That's years after the British supposedly have ceded the colony. So by very strategically ceding East Florida to the Spanish rather than to the Americans, because the Americans wanted it. And I've done a whole video series on how Washington and Jefferson was obsessed with Florida also, coveted Florida. But by ceding it to the Spanish, the British allowed their influence to continue in Florida for another 30 years or so, in addition to, I think, or another 40 years or so, I should say. I was doing my math wrong. And caused problems for the United States. Because I think even though they had ceded all this territory to the United States, all the way past the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, they were determined to box in the Americans. From the north with Canada, which they continued to control, from the south with Florida, which was under Spanish control, but the Spanish were a weakened power. The British would be able to kind of influence things there as they did, and then with their Caribbean possessions. So, and with the hope that the Spanish would keep Louisiana, which they eventually sold to the French. That caused a problem, right? And the French sold it to the Americans. But they thought they had the Americans boxed in.
And they did. And Americans, we feel boxed in all the time. Even though we had, quite a lot of territory, most of the same landmass as most of Europe, we felt confined right from the beginning. And you talked about the fact that the British left that ticking time bomb in the boundary of between Georgia and Florida. I really don't know if that was missed on the Americans. I think they welcomed that boundary dispute.
It gave them a chance to get aggressive, right, from the get-go.
Yeah. And I really think I think nobody should ever underestimate the foreign policy of the Spaniards, and I really think they knew that the writing was really just on the wall, that the clock was ticking from the moment they took back Spain, that the genie couldn't be put back into the bottle, that they wouldn't be going back to the start of the century. And I really don't think anybody really knew that this sort of sleepy agrarian merchant society that was just this little nook of the British Empire would become this very monstrous, aggressive, ambitious, budding nation so quickly. And with each different direction that we took, from the nationalized currency to the National Confederation, to the formation of three separate branches, to a president who gave up the power and a peaceful transfer of power. All of these different things were radical, revolutionary, historic precedents. And I think we really just scared the crap out of the old world. And with each passing year, it became obvious that we were coming after this continent, the whole of it. And nook or by crook, we were going to do it. And I think Britain really, I think when you see in the next century, you see how they were able to maintain sovereignty over, or at least partial sovereignty over Canada. I think it was pretty obvious that they learned their lesson from this conflict. Whereas you see Spain very quickly loses most of its territory down south.
Yep.
That they didn't learn anything a generation or two later. And so it's very interesting how the 19th century would be shaped by this century, and how every single major player would be radically changed in very quick order, and no one was spared. No one, from the Bourbons in France to eventually Havana Harbor towards the end of the 19th century, where America finally kicks out the Spanish Empire that began in 1492 here.
That is a good place to leave off, Robert. So next week we're going to pick up and I think finish our story on the American Revolution, finish our season and our narrative on the American Revolution, talking about the British abandoning East Florida after the treaties were signed.